Welcome back to the Talk Past podcast. I am NC, per usual. But today we're going to discuss D&D in relation to medieval history, and I am here with a good friend.
Hello, my name's Alan. I am the good friend.
A good friend. We play D&D a lot, except for last year and this year because of situations. But let's just go into it. So obviously, in terms of introduction of what we do, D&D Dungeons and Dragons. Uh, let's just start with relation to the game. How long have you been playing D&D?
I've been
And your
playing,
your introduction to it.
my introduction was probably friends of about the same age when I was 10, 11, 12 years old, in elementary school at that time. That
Hmm.
was in the mid 80s. And, of course, we started off with the Red Box, which was just Dungeons and Dragons at that point. And then from there, advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And then, uh, from that point on, just kind of it was a casual part of my life, getting together with friends, enjoying ourselves, sometimes doing more laughing and and messing around rather than serious gameplay. It
Which
was
is
a good
sometimes the
social.
point of it.
Right.
Yeah. So basically, started with first edition.
Right. I think they call it OD&D nowadays,
Mm.
which was original Dungeons and Dragons,
Yeah.
um, or basic Dungeons and Dragons. That's probably the red box. Most people
Hmm.
wouldn't know the red box to which I'm referring. Just very basic rules.
Yeah. Of course, there's like 100 versions of it now, and branching off into things like Pathfinder and whatever else is out there. But
Hmm.
for me, actually, it was before that I knew you guys, because obviously I started playing with you guys back in, I think it was 2010. Um, Obviously, I'd spoken with Dave during the Harry Potter event, and he's like, "Hey, do you want to play D&D with us?" And I'm like, "Okay." But prior to maybe a couple of years prior, was visiting Belfast, Maine, and it's just a tiny little souvenir town, kind of like a little port town in Maine. I know nothing about it except for that. But we went into like a gift shop, and I think at the time I knew very little of D&D, but was interested. And they had a D&D starter box, or at least I thought it was. And so I bought that. Went back to the campsite because we were staying at a campsite at the time. Someone was developing land, and I'm like, "Oh, okay, well, check it out." And then when I get home, deal with it. And when I opened it up, it had your pieces. It had dice, everything that you should basically need in a D&D set, but it was the game of Clue. But it was basically D&D, the game of Clue. And I was like, I'm not, is this it?
Not very impressed at
No,
that point.
no, clearly did not look in the box that said Clue. But it said just Dungeons and Dragons basic starter box. But in any case, obviously, the actual playing was with you guys uh,
Right.
after
Right.
doing the Harry Potter show and then Sarasota
Right.
Medieval Fair.
Well, over the years, as it's evolved, there have been different ways to try to encourage people to play. And so, I think you're looking at a Wizards of the Coast sort of starter pack to get, to kind of get your first taste of D&D. And they've done that with over the course of the years, different ways. And I think that in the original, we're talking back in the 70s, we're talking about with Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax, that those two guys, they started off with a company called TSR, which was, I think it's Tactical Studies and Rules. And,
Yeah.
and it was really wargaming. And so the 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 um the creative impetus for them, or the big idea for them was, hey, wargaming, you're following all these specific rules, from a huge, standpoint of a battlefield.
Hmm.
And then they said, hey, and Dave Arneson, I think, was kind of the catalyst to this. He said, hey, what if I was not one person? What if I was not a military formation, but I was one person
Mhm.
in that military formation. I was one person and I was playing a role. And so here we go, role playing games, RPGs.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, the most famous offshoot beyond just the game, the tabletop game, is Magic the Gathering, which is
Mhm.
same vein except card games, which is cardboard crack that we know.
Right. Well, there have been collectible card games over the course of the years,
Hmm.
um, but you're right. And Magic, as I understand it, I'm an okay Magic player, but I'm by no means a great strategist. I have some decks that I know how to exploit different things, but I
Hmm.
don't collect cards. And I think
Yeah.
originally it was a card game that you played in between events at conventions. Just a quick sort of impromptu, hey, let's throw
Yeah.
down some cards and play.
Yeah. No, I'm terrible at it. I have to learn how to play it every time, which means I it just I don't know. I'm used to Pokemon cards, which are very simple. Even though when I tried to play it, other players took it to a whole different level than I realized. So now my whole card thing is just I like the art. That's
Right.
it. Just the art. You don't have to buy cards to enjoy the art. You can just download it, which is fine with me. But
That's right.
beyond that, of course, go back to
Mhm.
D&D. Now, specifically our group, obviously I don't know much about the group before I came in, beyond stories from games that we've had, of course. But obviously our group it tends to revolve around our influences, which specifically, for some of us, myself included, does involve historical settings, or at least medieval history, or at least trying to involve some semblance of that. Um, Obviously, myself, Dave, because we do the Sarasota Medieval Fair, but I know you have interests in history as well. I know you've always talked about a Bronze Age game. Uh, what is your sort of take from actual history, implementing that into our games.
Well, I mean, history plays a very big deal when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons and the settings that you may be involved in.
Mhm.
Um, and just for clarification, I don't have any sort of history credentials. I'm
Right.
I'm a fan of history. I enjoy
Yeah.
history. I think that those stories that have been passed down are really really and so when I say stories, it's really influential, of course, to Dungeons and Dragons. People think of the Arthurian legends and in the Anglo-Saxon, the wars that they had back on the British Isles and in Brittany as well. Which is that little bit that sticks out from the coast of France, that was a large part of a greater English and Anglo-Saxon empire, well,
Yeah.
kingdom at some point. Um, of course, Arthur, if you're talking about Arthur, he's largely made up by by writers over the course of the
Yeah.
years. There is some kernel of truth somewhere, I suppose, and people, have expounded on that for years and years. But it's that whole mythical, myths and monsters and slaying dragons and
Mhm.
magic and and all of that is based, from Dungeons and Dragons, based in history. And there's no way to underestimate the impact of other sources, such as Tolkien. And I think
Yeah.
Gygax had an issue with that because I think he and Arneson, but more Gygax, wanted to insist that they kind of came up with the idea of Dungeons and Dragons based on their historical research, rather than kind of got cheating off of what Tolkien had written down.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
It's
but
very common knowledge, at least theory, that they basically Lord of the Rings came first, and that inspired Dungeons and Dragons, and now, of course, Lord of the Rings inspires D&D games.
mhm, mhm. But when you talk about history in general, people think of the Middle Ages,
Yeah.
or they it's the Dark Ages, which is kind of is a term which has fallen out of favor because there
It's
wasn't
really
really a
dark.
dark age during the Dark Ages.
Yeah.
Um, it was a pullback from the fall of the Roman Empire, and specifically that's even the fall of the Roman Empire is kind of a not real either because it's just kind of the decay of the Western Roman Empire because
Mhm.
when Constantine went and founded Constantinople in the Byzantine Empire, they called themselves the West. They called themselves the Roman Empire. They just did it in Greek rather than in Latin, and they did it from Constantinople rather than from Rome. Um, Constantinople, not Istanbul. Um,
Hmm.
so it's an old They
Yeah.
Might Be Giants joke for those of you who may not know. Um, but anyway, I think one thread that goes through that is in the Middle Ages. Um, there was in the West, in France, there was these people, and in Germany and in Rome, that they would walk around and they'd see these huge colosseums, that were decaying and crumbling. They would see these big, aqueducts and
Hmm.
towers and temples, and they wondered who on earth made this stuff. And in Dungeons and Dragons, there's a similar thing where we go into dungeons of a crumbled empire somewhere,
You,
trying. Sorry.
for the most part, yeah, yeah. You go through and explore legends
Right.
as they would have created back then.
hmm and that's something that we all kind of have it's in our blood, mysteries, from the ancient ones, where there's magic or
Mm.
rediscovered knowledge. Um, and that's an important thread that runs throughout D&D.
Yeah. D&D to me kind of seems like it's a running theme in a lot of the podcasts, and obviously discussing with me in person, that a lot of games and TV shows, like Fallen Kingdom and whatnot, which gets referenced a lot because it's Viking era, which is my preferred medieval period. The 900s tend to
hmm
be more sort of like this sort of generic medieval, which is like they cram everything that everybody knows about the medieval period into one thing, and then
Right.
they just it's some sort of vicarious time frame, and that's kind of what D&D does, where there's a lot of maybe kind of like a Game of Thrones thing, where it's a lot of just sort of like I guess you would say 1500s is sort of the time period, but I
hmm
mean you can play whatever time period you want in D&D. But what do you think of what we have done with our game as Thieves Guild specifically? What do you think is sort of our range of time period that you might pin on it?
Well, in a larger sense, well, just to go back, the middle, when we talk about medieval times in the Middle
Yeah,
Ages, that's generally considered from the fall of the Western Roman Empire, which is about 500
yeah,
AD, to the beginning, to the Renaissance, basically, the rebirth of civilization, as it's called. So, and that's also ties in with the Age of Exploration, um, you know, uh, just that expansion of knowledge, and it also has to do with other things, some climatic stuff, increases in population, due to what they call the medieval warming period, where
hmm,
you're able to grow grains and crops a little bit more easy. I mean, even like Greenland is, this is a little apocryphal, but Greenland is called Greenland. Some people think it was a marketing
yeah,
marketing term, but they were growing grain on the southern shores of tips of Greenland, during that time.
hmm,
So that's about the era we're talking about. Now, when the Middle Ages is kind of divided up into three ways. You have the early, and then the high Middle Ages, and then the late Middle Ages. And our games are probably more towards the high to late Middle Age
well, yeah,
uh, period of time there.
yeah. I mean, I know
Um,
we also tend to implement modern elements,
yeah.
which is whatever. Everyone plays their
Mhm,
own game differently, but yeah,
mhm,
no, when I try to think up of like DMing a game, I try to think of something which you know fail or no. Try to think of something in that sort of vein of the 900s to the 1300s is when I tend to
mhm.
think about it. Um, but I know the game itself, the books and stuff, has a lot of content that's really just everything put together up to it seems like the 1500s. But
Mhm.
I know you wanted to
Yeah,
do
once you start getting to gunpowder, that's when things,
the
take a turn.
blunderbuss, yeah,
Mhm. That's
uh,
kind of when,
yeah,
things like crossbows and bows and arrows and swords fall into favor. Just
indeed,
because it's you know, gunpowder, and not that gunpowder wasn't used before. Of course, the Chinese had gunpowder, who knows how long
Hmm.
ago, and the Mongols were using it during their invasions of Europe in the 1200s, late 1200s. So it's not.
Yeah, it's something that came with as any technology we have today. Once it comes out, it's kind of like a slow roll
Mhm.
depending on its use if it, or need. Like gunpowder took away the need or use for like plate armor and certain other
Mhm.
armors because it just goes right through it. So same
Right.
thing with chainmail. Chainmail protected against certain weapons, and once you had plate, then you had to adapt and stuff like that. So it
Mhm.
depends on the region and introduction and the use regarding that. But
Right.
also, D&D has magic, so that kind of is a
Mhm.
whole other situation.
Right. Right. And so you have kind of this blending of the old, magic, that they were talking about during the
Mhm.
Arthurian legends, with a Merlin and whatnot, and that stuck on top of or augmenting, 13 to 1400 Europe.
Yeah, I mean, also though, magic was prevalent back then. Uh, Not saying it's real, but people believed in it
Hmm.
pretty heavily, and it was a major omen or
Hmm.
faith based or in terms of medicine. You have no idea how many people who are doing the festival for the first time. Of course, the medieval fair, and they walk up to the producer or the director or whomever they think is in charge, and they're like, "Can I be a witch?" And we're like, "Well, what is everybody playing today for what's our scenario? Everyone's Christian? Okay, well, no, no, you can't.
Right.
Or everyone is a Viking, so they're of pagan of sort, or of that sort of alternate belief. No, because even still, um, but I mean, it doesn't mean that it wasn't prevalent and wasn't a thing. But obviously, it's completely different in terms of historical magic with D&D magic, like bags of holding and mimics and
Hmm.
cheating
Yeah, a
genie.
lot. Right. Well, that's a good point. The genie in the bottle. When you're
Mhm.
talking about Aladdin and the stories back then, that's another example of magic in other cultures, and it's not just only Western Europe we're talking about. Um, and what we're familiar with, it's all those other things. I think that there are some D&D monsters that are drawn from legend.
Mhm.
Oh, I can't remember what the displacer beast is. There's something about the displacer beast that was like it was based on a real monster. But I think maybe the original name of that monster was not really pronounceable to American audiences, so they called it
Yeah,
the displacer beast.
I mean, a lot of
Um,
things in the books, the monster manual and the general books themselves. I mean, they still come from actual myth and legend. I know there's some
mhm,
things maybe now that are kind of just thrown to the wind,
mhm,
but you see a lot of things that were things back then, at least in terms of legends, like the cockatrice. Um,
mhm.
I was while you were talking trying to think of something relating to like a mimic, but the only thing I can think of is when you stub your toe or you land on an object or something like that, you trip because you're walking by a table and you're like, "Oh, the table attacked me."
Yeah,
So you have that simple belief that kind of becomes a monster
right, right.
with teeth and a challenge
Mhm.
rating, and hopefully,
Well, I
oh,
mean,
go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say that going back to that reminds me of I went on a trip to France with a um, I have a friend, a very dear, he's like a brother to me
Yeah.
that's Parisian, and so I went on one summer trip. I went to France, and we went to Brittany. We went to Bretagne, as they say in French. Um, and he was telling me that a lot of the D&D monsters that we know of, the Tarrasque, for
Yeah.
example,
Leviathan.
that is right. That's from that part of France. At least that's what he told me, and he was French, so I have to believe him.
Mhm.
Um, so a lot of those monsters do come from the mythology.
Yeah.
Um,
But yeah, obviously, there's things like dinosaurs, which I think are a more modern monster to D&D, though, To me, back then, they thought it was completely something else. Like
Mhm.
elephant skulls, they thought were
Right.
giants,
Right.
which looks like it, but I've always wanted to do like a Japanese scenario, not not
Mm.
not like a Japanese anime kind of game, but something based in the time frame of Queen Pimiko, which is Japanese medieval history. Something very grounded, something very
Mhm.
simple. Um, but I know you wanted to do like a Bronze Age game, right?
Yeah.
What makes you want to do that, and how would you implement that?
Um, because the Bronze Age, that's also another an interesting period of time where you had this huge, um, you had a great advancement in knowledge. You know, you had tremendous arts being created. It's of course a lot of that's lost to history, as we now know. And then at the
Yeah,
end of the Bronze Age, something happened, and we're not really sure what. And anyone who says that they know exactly what happened, they don't.
right.
Because and I have read books and on this, and it's very complicated as to what. But the interesting thing is that we have actual firsthand accounts of things that were happening in the Bronze Age, and so
Hmm.
to me, that's if you set a D&D game at the end of the Bronze Age, when you started finding letters from people saying, "Hey, something happened to this town down the road. We don't know exactly what." And then you find out that a town that's a little bit closer, down the road, something happened to it, and you don't know. That's a fun basis for a game, I think. I say it also dials things back a little bit, um, because I am probably known in my games for trying to keep things as simple as possible,
Hmm.
um, because I usually play human, you know, and
Yeah,
other people
that's
are like,
great.
"Why would you want to play a human? You're a human in real life. You should be an elf, or you should be an orc, or something interesting." It's
Hmm.
like, well, it's because I am a human, and I'm playing a role, and this is what I'm familiar with.
Yeah,
And it's not that I lack the imagination, because I have been all kinds of different things. You've been playing for, you know, 35 years. Um, you've done everything at least 10 times. And so for me, the Bronze Age game would allow me to kind of dial things back. You wouldn't have quite as advanced armor. You wouldn't have quite as advanced weaponry. You would have
yeah,
weapons that get dull, shields that get damaged. So you'd kind of have to be more realistic to me. Um, and then there's the magic system that you would have is based on completely it would have to be based on elemental things,
hmm,
or it'd have to be based on superstition of some kind, or it'd have to be based on the faiths of that time, which would be totally unfamiliar to pretty much everyone.
yeah. Um, I don't even know what they would have had at that point. But
Well, it's just
oh,
sorry, go on.
uh, but also Bronze Age itself would be a fascinating topic for perhaps another uh, episode. But yeah, no, I remembered that I tried to do something similar in obviously just your generic medieval setting, but I tried to like make it realistic. But I think I also made
Hmm.
it too convoluted. That was my first TMing a campaign thing. That was like, oh, I'm gonna make something simple, and then I didn't. Second one, I'm just like, it's just D&D. It's just D&D. Let it be D&D. Focus instead on making events for people to interact with rather than the world itself. It would be an interesting thing to delve into both as a topic, but also as a
Hmm.
game, because the idea of not knowing what's going on with the world around you, obviously, that's relatable still today, because I have no clue what day it is usually until I check my phone and then I forget. But not knowing what's going on around you, things are changing frequently, all the time. But if it's something that's dramatic enough to change the world as we experience with things like mobile phones changing the world, the internet, etc., and then trying to figure out what's going on and then how to adapt to that in a setting that's medieval or even is interesting because how do you delve into that and what is it that caused such a rift either in a country or a town or globally?
Hmm. Well, that's you're kind of getting at the heart of playing a role, because
Mhm.
you're in the moment, you're trying to, find your way through the world, and the world presents obstacles to you. And um, I think that D&D in a way makes you feel like you have a bit more control over things, because you can use magic, because you can swing your sword. You can't really do that here in the real world.
Yeah.
Um, so, but when you see like things, relationships between towns, between countries, between enemies, and of course between different races, that kind of goes along the historical, you know, um, in a historical context. It goes along with what's happened as we compete over resources with different races. Okay, and in this case, races we're talking about the Mongols versus the Hungarians versus the Rus versus or the Russians that time versus the
Yeah.
Vikings. You know, and so I'm not sure if that completely answers your question.
Give or
Um,
take. Give or take. Yeah.
mhm,
There's a lot going on in history that can be taken as inspiration for games or not. But I mean, you can apply a lot of things in history and people into the various races that you get to play, such as
mhm,
orcs and halflings. I know our friend Dave has halflings as merchants, as it's very big with him.
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
our friend Jonathan, very specific with Drow, and they play very specific roles in his games. Uh, what is that like for you in terms of coming up with a game? Well, we'll think about Thieves Guild, which is a one-shot game that we do. Usually, it's just lasts one night, which is like whatever many hours, 4 or 5 hours. How
Mhm.
do you prepare in terms of that?
Yeah, well, just I mean, to first of all, just to everyone on the same page, we came up with. So we had this problem playing D&D, which I think a lot of people have had who play D&D, and that is you can never get anyone's schedules to line up exactly right.
Yeah,
And so inevitably, if you had a campaign and you had six people around the table, generally you would only have five people, and then you'd have to catch somebody up where they were in the cosmic toilet, as we used to say. They were in the bathroom basically while the game went on. And then the next week would come, and you probably miss another couple players, and then you get to the point where we can't play without the cleric, and he's out of town this week or she's out of town this week. So let's just hold off the game for a week, which turns into 2 weeks, which can turn into when was the last time we played this campaign, and
yeah,
what were we doing last time? I forget what happened. Were we at the tavern or were we in the dungeon? And so that's the obstacle that we had in our gaming group. And so I came up with a concept of having a one night game where you were a group of thieves in this town of Greyhawk, the city of Greyhawk, which is a traditional setting in Dungeons and Dragons.
hmm,
Books have been written about the setting, novelizations. So the town of Greyhawk, and you had a mission that was given to you by the Thieves Guild, um, and you had to get it taken care of that night. And if you didn't, then that was it. You just
yep,
failed in your mission, and you
yeah,
didn't get paid. Okay, so it was a way of having a one night, one shot, 4 hour game, and if someone could show up, great. If they couldn't show up, that's okay. We tried to keep things about the same level, and we created. It can get more complicated, but we tried to keep it as simple as possible.
hmm,
And it was mainly a filler game, and then we discovered that we kind of liked it.
yeah.
And so we did more Thieves Guild games than we did campaign games, because it was convenient. You
Yeah, no,
Um,
I definitely have a preference for the Thieves Guild games to the campaign games
mhm,
that we've all done. I know the last one that we did was in terms of campaign, because I don't remember the last Thieves Guild one. But obviously, we were trying to do uh, the mission or a sequel mission to dealing with Loth, the
mhm,
Drow spider demon situation, because in a previous campaign we had failed that mission. We failed the campaign
yeah,
and unleashed all the demons, so we came back and we're trying to do that. But as you had mentioned, there's always an issue. There's always someone's absent or someone's plural is absent, and then it becomes a point where, of course, we have like a D&D drought as a group, which is the
yeah,
holiday season. So you
and
got months.
the fair
Mhm.
season as well.
I don't have the best memory, so I don't ever remember anything we've ever done until we actually start doing things. Then I'm like, oh, I remember that, or oh, I remember that. that
Mm-hmm.
relevant to this game, though.
Hmm.
Of course, we have two new additions in our group that we haven't played in like a year and a half. That actually write things down, so that's good for memory. But I've always loved the Thieves Guild because we can just it's like a pop-up tent. You know, you
Yeah.
set it up, enjoy it, you take it down, and
Hmm.
you can come back another time when it's best available, or be if you can't, it's okay.
Hmm. Yes, I think that was real successful, and it's an idea. I wonder if there was some way I could market it, but but it's
Well,
out there and
uh,
people do.
uh, not to cut into you, but I did actually want to bring it up because that's why I brought up Thieves Guild. But and I should have watched it before this to rejog my memory. But I posted a video in our Thieves Guild group on Facebook where someone who discusses history
Hmm.
in on YouTube, which obviously I'll get to live action on my YouTube channel eventually. But they actually went down the historical aspect of Thieves Guild, actual historical thieves guilds, and how practical that
Right.
was, and whatnot. I don't know if you watched it. I posted it, but even
Mhm.
I glossed over it at first. But I thought that
Yeah,
was fascinating.
I did watch that, and it is fascinating, just the concept of, did this type of thing really exist?
Hmm.
You know, and there's a larger question of, did medieval guilds really exist?
Yeah.
Um, and I think the general consensus is yes, although they may not have been as formalized as we like to think that they were.
All right.
Um,
It's the idea of societies or secret societies or public societies.
right,
You know, like
right, and that varies from town to
knights and whatnot.
town. You know, and and so, different cities, have,
Hmm.
it all is a matter of, the old Latin saying, qui bono, who benefits, who
Yeah.
benefits from this. And if the people who benefit are the rich and powerful, then that's going to, cause, um, a lot of interest and influence. And we
Yeah.
actually played around with that in the early days of our Thieves Guild adventures. We played around with the concept of influence, and I actually created sort of an influence table and how to gain influence and hierarchy. And it started getting a little bit too complicated, and then I don't. I was kind of pleased to see. I think it was Cityscape, one of the 3.5 edition rule books came out. I think it was Cityscape, and they talked about influence, and it was very similar to what I had laid out in myself, just sort of on a whim. So the concept of the guild, is it we have a very formalized guild structure in the game, and it involves, who's the guild leader in, particular parts of Greyhawk. If you're in the River Quarter, just the different town quarters and such. Um, so that does matter. You but the beauty of the Thieves Guild game is that it is supposed to be one shot. It's supposed to be one night. That's not to say that it hasn't lasted a couple nights, because
Oh yeah.
sometimes they do get complicated. Players have a way of getting in the way of the dungeon master's plans,
Hmm.
and
And
we've
some
all
games are
experienced
intended
that.
as a two-parter or so.
Right, right,
But even then, I think some of our two-parters have been allowed to just like, hey, these are punks, which is of course for the listeners are first to third level entry people,
hmm.
and then okay, the punks are doing this, but next game it's a sequel or it's a continuation, but this group, if you show whoever's showing up, whoever has the median level,
Hmm.
that's what we're doing. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, you're right. We have had that where, the whole concept is every player starts at level one, and you have to get a certain number of missions that are successful under your belt before you can become an officially fully fledged member of the guild. And then at that point, take it away. You can do what you want. Like Dave, for instance, um, he has a very well developed character, who has gone so far as to become. And those of you who know Dave, you will not you will not the irony will not be lost on you. Um, Dave actually bought some buildings and has become a slumlord.
Mm.
So he charges rent. He has a steady stream of income. There's a bar or a tavern there, and he has his side business working for the guild. And his character has its own sort of hobbies. She has her own hobbies. So Dave has taken that character very, very, has developed the heck out of that character,
Yeah.
and he enjoys that. My wife, she became sought through the guild to become apprenticed to a apothecary, but he was really a poison master, and so she's gained levels over the course of the years we played these games, and so now she's a very well respected poison master in her own right. So that's what the fun part of what the guild is, that you can take it as far as you want to, but
Yeah.
then again, sometimes you die.
Yep. In D&D and in history, in the real
Hmm.
world. Although it's a lot
Yep.
different in the real world, you can't re-roll.
Right, and you
Uh,
can't know the resurrections, as they
no,
say.
no. There's no death knells and all that stuff
Right.
too.
But in D
But
and D, there are, oh yeah, Death
D&D,
Knell. Oh, so much fun with Death Knell.
mm-hmm.
There
And
have been
necromancy.
instances where members of the guild, because you're on a mission and you have to complete the mission, and I have seen and maybe possibly done myself Death
Mhm.
Knell on a fellow party member in order to complete the mission,
Yeah,
and that
yeah.
that causes some awkwardness at the table, of course.
Eh, I think at this point it's expected every now and then.
Mm,
It's kind
yeah.
of meta.
Yeah.
But as we finalize toward the end of our time, I wanted to discuss a little bit more on terms of the societies. So obviously, in our specific game, we do have that. That becomes the basic gist of the game, which is it is a medieval thieves guild. But all of our characters, like all of us in the real world, are unique. We all have different goals and aspirations and beliefs, and there's a lot of that in D&D in terms specifically. I'm speaking of belief system. So the faith system, like Cuthbert and
Yeah, yeah, we've kind of avoided
so.
talking about that
Mhm.
because that's the
But
huge part of the medieval time,
it is.
the Catholic Church.
Well, but not just them. Obviously, there's other things in terms of societies, such as Templars, which obviously does delve into religious, but
Hmm.
that kind of took a rather interesting swerve toward the end of the Templars' existences. But there's also the Order of the Garter, and there's all the orders, and there's all these other religions and faiths and beliefs that are also societal. But what in D&D, I don't have one. But in D&D, what is your favorite sort of society or faith that a character can be part of or
Hmm.
aspire to?
Well, if we're talking about 3.5, okay,
Which is the
uh,
one we play.
yeah, which is the one we play, and we have incorporated parts of Pathfinder, which is a Paizo creation. We've taken some of that, and I know, and people have done fourth edition and Nidney Next and fifth edition and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for me, I have there's I have one love in my D&D life, which I'll set to the side just for a moment. But
Mm-hmm.
in 3.5, I like a Church of St. Cuthbert.
That's what
That
I
really,
mentioned, yeah.
yeah, I really do like that. And I have some magazine articles, Dragon Magazine, talking a bit more in depth about the background of St. Cuthbert. And of course, there was a St. Cuthbert, back in the day. Um,
Yep.
and not only Saint Cuthbert, I think of the cudgel. I have dressed up as a follower of Saint Cuthbert for Halloween. So I like Saint Cuthbert. Um, the other one though that I really like is called Farlong, and that's the god of travel. He's not really a major god, probably a middle or a
Mm-hmm.
minor god, and because travel and adventure go hand in hand. you know, And I like that idea of being able to go from place to place. And people forget that that was a big deal. If you were a scholar, back in medieval times, then you were expected to travel to different places to get knowledge and to spread knowledge, because after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, um, and some writers have written about this, including the well-known book by I think Thomas Cahill, which is part of his Hinges of History series. It is how the Irish saved civilization. And the idea is that with the downfall of Rome, order in society became more difficult, more tenuous, and so you had these monasteries. Cassiodorus, who is probably the creator of what we consider now the idea of monks in monasteries writing down knowledge and copying books. And there's this whole other part of the medieval period that we haven't talked about because it's not really germane to a idea of D&D based in Western Europe, and that is, it was not the end of the world in the Middle East, in the Islamic world, in Arabia, in Persia. Indeed, you had during the Middle Ages in Europe, you had the Eastern Roman Empire, which was going on. You had the Umayyad, I may be pronouncing that wrong, empire, which was then succeeded by the Abbasid Empire, which was an absolutely gorgeous example of civilization. I mean, if you were going to be anywhere in history other than today, then being dropped in Baghdad during the height and the splendor of the Abbasid period would probably be it. Arabic was a really important language back in the day. Everything was written in Arabic. Even the Jewish philosopher Maimonides, and apologies to the pronunciation, but even he wrote his great works in Arabic. It was an important language of the day. But to me, traveling and sages and scholars going from place to place, I really like that god of Farlong, because there's way stations along the road when you're traveling. There's clerics you run into that have a little bit of knowledge here and there. They're not as flaky as bards, but they do have that extra knowledge. And with that in D&D comes power, whether in the form of magic or in strategy or in technique, feats, skills, that kind of thing.
Yeah, for me, since there's so many, I don't really delve too much into a faith-based character, but it reminds me of the old Roman and Greek gods, which obviously are the same thing. But that's sort of, I was about to say polyamorous, a polytheistic idea. So that to me always kind of had that sort of thing, because we always had like oracles or places of worship in the game, fountains, whatnot. So to me, it always struck me as a very sort of Greek influenced style of creating the gods in the game.
Right. And I alluded to it earlier. I'm a huge fan of the Dragonlance setting, and which is just another setting. Like Greyhawk is a setting, the Underdark is a setting, and they sometimes overlap. But Dragonlance is its own world, Kryn, and it has its own gods. And so I'm very familiar with the works of Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss. I've met Tracy Hickman and his wife Laura, on several occasions at cons. And of course, he also did the Ravenloft stuff as well, which he can talk about for hours, because I have sat and talked and listened to him talk for hours about it firsthand. But I really like Dragonlance and Kryn and the gods there. And the interesting thing to me about that is, if you're familiar with Dragonlance, it starts off with the gods are gone, the gods have left, the gods have abandoned the world because of how the world treated them. And so if you think about Greek and Roman gods, like you brought up, there's this, have those gods abandoned us? Are they still around? There are still people who take the Greek gods seriously,
or the Viking gods, Thor and Freya, Loki, etc.
Oh yeah, all the Norse things too.
Myself, I've read.
Sorry,
just a quick notation. I've read the first book, Dragonlance, and I know we did a Dragonlance game too, which I think is why I've read the first book, but I haven't read any of the others. It just reading. Sometimes reading doesn't happen.
Well, one of the other things is that they are written kind of pseudo children's book kind of thing. Yeah. So it's so I loved them when I was 14. I have reread them since then, and they have lost some of their magic. And you do see some echoes of other fantasy literature in their writing, But the fun thing about Dragonlance is that basically Margaret Weiss was a dungeon master, and she had players around her table, and it was basically Dragonlance, and then they novelized it.
Yeah.
So when you are reading those Dragonlance books, the first three books generally, it is actual. It's a D&D game, so to speak.
Yeah. With encounters and
Yeah.
events that kind
Yeah.
of mirror what we do.
Mhm.
But let's go ahead and wrap it up then, because obviously you and I and our group in particular could discuss D&D ad nauseum, as well
Mhm.
as history. So maybe some other time, or maybe one day we'll, for the channel, film a game, a Thieves Guild game or something like that. But beyond that,
Yeah. If we ever
obviously,
get back to normal, whatever normal
yeah,
is going forward.
right, new normal or normal
Mhm.
plus, new game plus. Um, is there anything in terms of closing that you wanted to bring up, or delve into quickly?
Um, well, there's when talking about history, of course, there's tons of things to say. In the context of D&D, um, it sets the stage. And if you study your history, if you study your medieval professions, if you look online for lists of roles that history can add flavor to your game.
Yeah.
And it's mainly just that extra bit of description that takes your players. If you're the dungeon master, it takes your players to that world. If you describe that someone, for instance, there was a profession called a pender, and a pender was someone who went around town, and he was kind of like the the dog catcher. Except in medieval times, you had cows and chickens and horses and things and donkeys and animals, and he was a professional that went around and collected stray animals and took them back to their owners.
Yep. Chicken
So
chaser.
if you have a setting and you, as a DM, as a game master, as the ref, you say, okay, and then coming down the street is a fellow leading a donkey by a rope. Um, and if you talk with that person, then they may have some, that person knows other people around town. Said, oh yeah, the Smith farm. I'm taking this to the Smith farm. Oh, you're looking for information here. It's a way of having
Hmm.
historical context that is real in your game.
Yeah. And
So by
and
studying history, you can add those extra little bits of flavor to the game, and your
exactly.
players will thank you for it.
For me, doing the festival, I've never really had a major interest in history. I'm
Mhm.
more of a prehistory person, and very specifically Triassic to the Cretaceous. I don't really care about anything beforehand or after, with exception of obviously that very small medieval time frame of the 900s to the 1300s, which to me is the epitome of medieval. But beyond that, since I started doing the festival and D&D, you have this sort of inspiration of testing things that are in the game,
Mhm.
such as armor and how armor is affected by certain things. Like padded armor should be worth, in terms of defense, much more than leather armor, especially since leather armor wasn't really a thing in medieval times. Um, but beyond that, of course, that's a whole other topic that gets
Oh
brought up
yeah.
a lot. Um,
Well, that's another
oh,
thing. History teaches you, they say history doesn't repeat itself, but history rhymes. So
mhm,
you can learn about things that worked in the past. You can read about people's mistakes in the past and it'll influence your choices in the future. That's why
right.
we study history.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely watched a lot of, now specifically, but when we started gaming and doing the festival, watched a lot of historical YouTube channels and documentaries, and learning about things, and watching certain YouTubers testing things
Yep.
and integrating that into games. Like my interest in doing
Mhm.
a historical Japanese game, not specifically about Pimlico, but that time frame where it was medieval, because I have a book that's about the medieval history of Japan, from start up to modern. Um, so it's definitely, history definitely inspires, or if
Mhm.
not, playing the game itself can definitely make you interested in things of historical significance, especially if you don't
Mhm.
know what something is, like the difference between a tavern and an inn, or the difference between padded armor and brigandine or whatever.
Mhm.
It's definitely a gateway to other pathways some consider to be historically natural,
Mhm.
for Star Wars reference. But beyond that, which is not in any way, shape, or form historically natural uh, or accurate. But in any case, because we could obviously go on ad nauseum about this, we'll go ahead and close it out. But that's been this episode, talking about D&D and kind of how it marries into history a little, even with the fantasy elements. I am NC, your usual host.
Yes. Hi, folks. It's Alan signing off.